Hey everyone, I hope you're having a nice weekend. Congratulations on finishing your first week of our class. It looks like everybody's getting the rhythm of reading, reflections, and posting responses, and posting your quiz scores. So I think everything is looking good. If you have questions, please do feel free to reach out and ask. I'm happy to clear anything up. I think that we'll have an office hour on Wednesday of this week. It's a little bit tricky. My schedule is hard to find a good office hour that meets everybody. And we can't really accommodate everybody, but I'm trying. So we'll probably be Wednesday at 6 p.m. So look for the Zoom. I'll send a Zoom link out on Tuesday, but we'll have an office hour. Again, those aren't obligatory. Those are voluntary. So just feel free if you'd like to pop in. You can pop in. I've finished reading your discussions on the Doing Not Dualism chapter. And I'll say a few comments here in a minute about those. What I want to say is here's how to have a successful week number 2. So you'll continue reading the book, Blessed Are the Peacemakers. You'll see in the overview in week 2's module that there's a link to Blessed Are the Peacemakers, and there's also a link to the Moral Norms chapter in Kingdom Ethics. We're going to talk about a little bit about moral norms. I'll post a lecture here in a little bit, I think this evening. And we're going to talk about a few things that we assume from the Introduction to Christian Ethics class that I teach. So we're going to kind of define Christian ethics. We're going to talk about authorities in Christian ethics. We will talk about virtues of scriptural interpretation, and then we'll talk about moral norms. And the reason that we're talking about moral norms is you're going to watch a film. So a lot of you commented on Bonhoeffer from your reading, Doing Not Dualism. And we're going to watch a film in this week called Weapons of the Spirit. There's a link to the film and the password. You cannot pass this film around. This is on loan to me by permission of the producer. And they're in beta version right now, so you can't pass this around, but you can watch it because he really wants evangelicals to watch this film. And so what I'll want you to do is in your reflections this week, talk about the moral norms that you saw, and then talk about your experience watching the film and the questions that it raised. So you're reading Blessed Are the Peacemakers. Again, you're watching the moral norms chapter is for your benefit and just to have the resource. And then you're watching the film Weapons of the Spirit. You don't have a quiz this week, but you do have a reflection on Weapons of the Spirit. So that's what you need to accomplish for this week. Remember, as you're reading Blessed Are the Peacemakers, that you'll have a kind of a midterm essay on the content of that book. So again, be watching out for the contours, the texture, and the richness of the arguments that Cahill is making for just war theory and for pacifism and nonviolence, and then again her just peace building idea paradigm that mirrors the just peacemaking paradigm that we'll look at a little bit later. So yeah, just kind of be taking notes, reading that one a little more carefully because it's one of our central texts for the class. Okay, so that's how to have a successful week. Continue reading Blessed Are the Peacemakers. The Moral Norms chapter in Kingdom Ethics is a resource for you as you watch the film. You're going to watch the film Weapons of the Spirit, and you're going to write a discussion and responses just like you did this last week on the book, but this time it's going to be on the film in the forum or the discussion forum that's at the end of this of Module 2. Okay, just a couple of words about your reflections on the Doing Not Dualism chapter. That's Glenn Stassen's. I know Glenn and David wrote the book. They wrote different chapters. This is really Glenn Stassen's interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, his 14 triadic initiatives, which I talked about a little earlier. I posted a lecture last Friday, I think, on kind of the origins of the idea of peacemaking and how that came about. And so we talked about Glenn's interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, the triadic initiatives, that leading to some principles of peacemaking from Jesus's teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, which also kind of moves into a few more principles added on that we can kind of observe are effective in peacemaking through God's common grace. And so that's kind of the ecumenical Christian argument for peacemaking that Glenn put together from different Christian perspectives. And then finally, the interfaith just peacemaking, which will be another core textbook for us in this class. So the things that I want to highlight, again, I said with Bonhoeffer, a lot of you commented on Bonhoeffer. Either you have an interest in reading more about Bonhoeffer, or you've taken the class, or you've just done your own research on Bonhoeffer. And the key thing about his life that scholars are still impressed with and wrestling with is his prescient kind of understanding of the horrors and the threat that Nazism was early on, before most people saw it, including Karl Barth. Karl Barth said about Bonhoeffer, "I wish I would have seen it as early as he did." And so we have to look into kind of what about Bonhoeffer, what brought this kind of noticing up. I want to suggest a book that a friend of mine wrote. He's a colleague. We went to Fuller together, got our PhDs together. His name is Reggie Williams, and he wrote a book called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And it talks about this particular aspect of Bonhoeffer's life, how Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem during his Sloan Fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in the 30s impacted him as he went back to Germany. After that year, he came in a German nationalist, and he left sympathetic with the Jewish community in Germany when he went back. And so what were the causes of there? And so Reggie talks about that in that book, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. And you always have to wrestle when you're doing something about Bonhoeffer. You have to wrestle with his kind of argument for pacifism in the book Discipleship, or in our English titles, The Cost of Discipleship, where he tackles the Sermon on the Mount there, and he has a kind of dualism that's calling the German Christians to repentance, a deeper commitment to their faith. And what Bonhoeffer was doing there in that book was actually challenging the church to stand up and to be distinctly Christian, not a nationalist Christian, not a Christian that's kind of aligned with what Hitler was doing and what the Nazis were doing, but to be a Christian that stood out in its distinctness as a person and as a community that follows Jesus. So in that one, it's very scripture heavy and very Sermon on the Mount heavy in Cost of Discipleship. And then later in Ethics, he only makes a couple of passing references to the Sermon on the Mount, and you have to ask what happened there. And Glenn's written an article about that you can look up in the library. But what happened from his writing of The Cost of Discipleship to his writing in Ethics, which he is writing towards the end of his life. And what Glenn argues there is that his kind of interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount wasn't able to carry him through the horrors that the Nazis were doing. And so he kind of moved away from that to be able to stand up and even participate in the coup against Hitler. So it's a really, really interesting question. He has a really textured life in Germany, and of course he died for standing against the Nazis. So yeah, it's a really really interesting question that I think Christian theologians and ethicists are wrestling with still. So that's well done on that. The other one that people commented on the most was the kind of dualism, the separation between the spiritual and the material, or the body and the spirit, politics and the church, those kinds of dualisms that Glenn was talking about. And he wants to incorporate a more holistic approach to our faith. And that's kind of his interpretation on the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is Lord of every area of our life, not just our spiritual life, not just our church life, but he is Lord over politics. Now, what that looks like is really important, especially when it comes to international relations and international conflict. And we'll talk more about that as we go along in the course of this in this class. So but in general, the emphasis for Glenn is on a more holistic approach to our faith, and we'll talk about that. That's really important in the concept of shalom, which I mentioned again earlier in the video, that shalom is a more holistic idea of peacemaking, not just the absence of conflict, but the flourishing of all of God's creation. And so we can't separate God's creation into these kinds of dualisms that we have in the past. Okay, so I think that's enough for now. Again, how to have a successful week. You're still reading Blessed Are the Peacemakers. Remember to read that carefully because you're going to be writing an essay on it. The Moral Norms chapter is for you. You don't have to read it all. It's just a resource for you as you watch the film, Weapons of the Spirit, and kind of analyze what moral norms are they appealing to when they make a decision. And then you're going to also write a reflection on that, and you're going to write a reflection on the same reflection, write about your experience with the film, not just kind of analyzing it for its moral norms. Do that, but also write about your experience. Okay. Again, congratulations on finishing week number 1. Seems like everybody's found their rhythm, and it's really fun to read your introductions and get to know a lot of you. A lot of folks that do music, and a lot of folks that like to cook, and even a few folks that play pickleball. So turning out to be a great class. Okay, have a great week this week. I'll be posting a couple more videos at the early part of this week, and then again we'll have an office hour on Wednesday.